Will rent stabilization in New York City ever end? This is a question people are debating, especially between landlords, building owners, legislators, community advocates, as the vacancy rate in New York City increases due to the health crisis. Since 1974, rent stabilization has depended on a housing emergency, defined in part by an apartment vacancy rate below 5%. In theory, if the vacancy rate goes above 5%, the justification for rent stabilization goes along with it. As it nears that now, people are saying legislators will never allow rent stabilization to expire in New York City. I'm Tom O'Byrne, real estate agent with Douglas Elliman Real Estate. I make videos on the New York and Long Island housing markets. Hit subscribe to stay up to date. Reach out if you would like assistance in buying or selling a home. My contact info is in the video description below. In a Real Deal article, Why Rent Stabilization Will Likely Never End in New York by Catherine Benzel writes, evidence is mounting that if the housing emergency, a vacancy metric used to justify rent control, should end, politicians would find another rationale to continue rent stabilization. According to the New York City Rent Guideline Boards, there are about 1 million rent-stabilized apartments in New York City. What makes them elusive is the fact that once someone rents a rent-stabilized apartment, they're unlikely to leave. Analysis by the Wall Street Journal once found that New York's rent regulation laws affect wealthy white residents in Manhattan more favorably than the city's low-income tenants, because basically they were there first. And again, once they have a rent-stabilized apartment, people tend to keep them. Economists say the system does provide affordability for tenants lucky enough to secure a stabilized unit, but at the expense of those who don't. But what is rent stabilization? Rent stabilization is a form of rent regulation in New York overseen by the New York State Division of Housing and Community Renewal. In a rent-stabilized apartment, rent can only be increased by what the city allows for. It gets adjusted every year. Most recently, the government of New York decided that they were going to put a freeze on rent-stabilized rents for between October 2020 and October 2021. Rent stabilization is often confused with rent control, but rent control essentially has been phased out and replaced by rent stabilization. For an apartment to be rent controlled, the same tenant or a lawful successor of that tenant, a family member or a spouse, needs to have been living in that apartment continuously since 1971. No new rent-controlled apartments are created, which makes them rare or nearly impossible to come by at this point. If you're a fan of the show Friends, wondering how Monica was able to afford her apartment, it was a rent-controlled apartment and originally her grandmother's. Little trivia for you. Rent stabilization generally applies to buildings with 6 or more units that were built before 1974. But thanks to certain tax abatements used by developers, some new buildings are also rent-stabilized in New York City. I've rented over 60 of them in the past year. They definitely exist, and you can definitely get one. New York law caps rents to prevent a tight housing market from pushing rents up, but provides that the limit would be eliminated if vacancies rise because rents would fall on their own, as is happening right now. In an article, New Yorkers' Exodus Could Unravel Rent Regulation by Georgia Cromray, Cromray writes, since 1974, rent stabilization has depended on a housing emergency, defined in part by an apartment vacancy rate below 5%. In 2017, there were 79,000 available rental units in New York City, or 3.63% of the total, as determined by the Department of Housing Preservation and Development's most recent official survey. In 2020, as of October, available apartments are at a record high in the 10-year history of StreetEasy's inventory tracker, and up 26% from a year ago. And the median rent in Manhattan has fallen by 10%. The vacancy rate has long been well below the threshold of 5%, but that is changing due to COVID in 2020. And people are debating if that will have an impact on the current policy surrounding rent stabilization. Landlord lawyer Sherwin Belkin, a partner at Belkin, Burden, Goldman, quoted in Cromray's article as saying, if there is a flight from the city, it is not out of the realm of possibility that the vacancy rate can go above the requisite threshold, thereby undermining the statutory basis for rent regulation. But on the tenant side, Ellen Davidson, a staff attorney at Legal Aid, agreed that it is theoretically possible, but she noted not before 2022 when the next housing and vacancy survey is expected to be released. This is done every 3 years. Mayor Bill de Blasio said this week that if the vacancy rate surpasses the 5% threshold, state lawmakers would move the goalposts. The mayor told reporters, I don't have a doubt in my mind that the legislator will immediately create continuity with our current approach to rent stabilization and rent control. We absolutely need that in New York City. De Blasio goes on to say, if there was any question about that, I and many others would be in Albany fighting for it immediately. But I'm quite confident they will help us continue to protect tenants. He has good reason to believe that. State Senator Brad Hoylman and Assembly Member Harvey Epstein in late July proposed a bill that would extend the city's declared housing emergency for 2 years beyond the pandemic. The bill's text is upfront about its purpose: to ensure that declarations of housing emergency that provide the basis for New York's system of rent regulations remain in effect regardless of the local vacancy rate. Hoylman said his bill would assure that tenants that they won't be at risk of losing those crucial protections simply because the vacancy survey is set to be conducted during a historic, unprecedented crisis beyond their control. Real estate professionals view the Manhattan lawmakers' bill as a sign that rent stabilization is not really about a housing emergency. Deborah Riegel, an attorney with Rosenberg and Estes, said, "It almost feels like Charlie Brown and Lucy, where she pulls the football out before he can get to it. If you are being intellectually honest, the premise for rent regulation, in theory, doesn't exist anymore." In a pending lawsuit challenging the state's rent stabilization law, real estate groups call the 5% threshold arbitrary and a part of a scheme that fails to alleviate the city's affordable housing shortage. Jay Martin, president of the Community Housing Improvement Program, one of the landlord groups behind the lawsuit, said, "I have no doubt that elected officials would continue to twist themselves in knots to find a legal rationale for a system that does not solve the problem that it claims to fix." C. Weaver, a tenant organizer at Housing Justice for All, a group that has been pushing for lawmakers to cancel rent during the pandemic, said, "The rent stabilization laws were always intended to protect renters during times of housing crisis," adding that renters are certainly living under extraordinary circumstances right now. Basically, Hoylman and Weaver think a sudden disruption like the one caused by COVID, one that started as a health crisis but now is also an economic crisis, which would then spill into being a housing crisis, that shouldn't be enough to sweep the carpet out from under tenants that rely on rent stabilization. Benzel closes with, "The state bill that would preserve rent stabilization, even if vacancies soar, is therefore not addressing an immediate threat to rent caps. Rather, it is a backup plan, part symbolism, to reassure tenants of New York City's more than 900,000 rent-stabilized apartments that no matter what, the system will continue as its critics suspected all along." Thanks so much for watching. I'm Tom O'Byrne, real estate agent with Douglas Elliman Real Estate. I make videos on the New York and Long Island housing markets. Hit subscribe to stay up to date. Reach out if you would like assistance in buying or selling a home. My contact info is in the video description below.